What if the most powerful nation on Earth stopped asking its allies for loyalty and started demanding something far more valuable instead? What if trade access, military protection, and diplomatic goodwill were no longer free? What if they came with a price tag? A quiet, behind-closed-doors price tag denominated in billions of dollars. That is not a hypothetical. That is happening right now. And the country being handed that bill is one of America's oldest and most faithful allies, Japan. A nation that has stood beside Washington for 8 decades, hosted American troops on its soil, and trusted the United States with its national security. And yet today, Japan is sitting across the negotiating table from Washington, staring down a wall of tariffs on one side, and a barely veiled request to help finance American debt on the other. This is not a trade spat. This is a structural shift in how American power operates in the world. Welcome back to the John Ag Official. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you are about to hear will completely change how you see global finance, American foreign policy, and the future of the world economy. Everything discussed in this video is based on publicly available information, credible financial analysis, and reported diplomatic frameworks. This content is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute financial or investment advice. All opinions expressed represent analytical commentary, not established fact. To understand the full weight of what is happening, you first have to understand what the U.S.-Japan relationship looked like before all of this. For nearly 8 decades, it was held up as the gold standard of post-war alliances. 2 former enemies became the closest of partners, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. Japan consistently ranked among America's top 4 or 5 largest trading partners, with bilateral trade flowing across hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. Japan bought American soybeans, aircraft, and financial assets. America bought Japanese cars, electronics, and precision machinery. Both sides called it a model of free trade. Japan also became one of the largest foreign holders of U.S. Treasury bonds on the planet, sitting on well over $1 trillion in American government debt. Tokyo did this voluntarily, not under pressure, not as a political favor, but because U.S. Treasuries were considered the safest, most reliable investment in the world. That relationship, built on trust and mutual benefit, is now being stress-tested in a way that it has never been before. And the stress is coming from a direction that few people expected. Not from a rival, not from an adversary, but from America itself. When the Trump administration returned to power, it came back with a far more aggressive trade posture than most of its allies had anticipated. Tariffs were no longer a negotiating threat held in reserve. They became the opening move, and Japan felt the impact almost immediately. The administration moved to impose sweeping tariffs on imported goods, with particular focus on automobiles. For Japan, this was not a minor inconvenience. The automobile industry is the single most important engine of Japan's export economy. Companies like Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Mazda collectively generate an enormous share of Japan's GDP and employ millions of people across the supply chain. A major tariff on Japanese vehicles entering the United States was not just a tax policy, it was a threat to the economic identity of an entire nation. Japanese officials understood immediately that this was not a routine trade disagreement. Something much larger was being signaled. Washington was not just unhappy with trade balances. Washington was creating leverage. And the question Tokyo had to answer, urgently, quietly, and very carefully, was this: leverage for what exactly? To answer that question, you have to look at the financial situation the United States finds itself in, because it is genuinely alarming, and it explains everything that follows. The U.S. national debt has surpassed $36 trillion. That number is almost too large to process, so let me give it some context. Every single year, the U.S. government must go back to global bond markets and refinance hundreds of billions of dollars in maturing debt. It essentially takes out new loans to pay off old ones, a process called rolling over the debt. For most of the period between 2008 and 2022, this was manageable because interest rates were near zero. The cost of borrowing was almost nothing. Then inflation arrived. The Federal Reserve responded by raising interest rates aggressively. And suddenly, the United States was rolling over its old cheap debt into new, far more expensive debt. The annual interest bill on America's national debt, the amount Washington pays every year just in interest before spending a single dollar on roads, schools, defense, or health care, has climbed sharply and is now approaching or exceeding $1 trillion annually, depending on which budget projections you reference. To put that in perspective, that figure is in the same ballpark as the entire U.S. defense budget. America is spending as much money just on debt interest as it spends defending the entire planet. That is a fiscal crisis in slow motion, and it is the hidden engine behind everything happening with Japan right now. Here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Inside Washington's policy circles and financial institutions, a framework has reportedly been under serious discussion, one that would use America's trade and security leverage to solve, or at least ease, its debt financing problem. The concept, which has been referred to in some financial and academic circles as the Mar-a-Lago Accord, a deliberate reference to the famous Plaza Accord of 1985, centers on a simple but audacious idea. What if allied nations, as part of broader trade negotiations, agreed to restructure their U.S. Treasury bond holdings? Specifically, what if they agreed to swap out their shorter duration bonds for ultra-long-term instruments, bonds lasting 50, 75, or even 100 years at locked-in lower interest rates? The benefit to the United States would be massive. You lock in cheap financing for generations, dramatically reducing the annual interest burden on the federal government. You stabilize your debt servicing costs at a time when market interest rates are uncomfortably high. The cost, however, falls entirely on the other side. The country making the swap, in this case Japan, surrenders the flexibility that comes with short-duration bonds. They lock themselves into a long-term arrangement at a rate that may look very unfavorable over the coming decades, especially in an inflationary environment. In simple terms, Japan takes on enormous long-term risks so that America can shed it. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has reportedly been involved in shaping elements of this broader strategic framework, though the details remain largely behind closed doors. At this point, you're probably asking the most logical question in the world. Why would Japan agree to any of this? Why would a sovereign nation voluntarily enter into a financial arrangement that so clearly benefits the other party? The answer lies in a set of constraints that Japan has lived with since 1945. Japan's constitution, written in the aftermath of World War II under direct American supervision, places strict limitations on the country's military capabilities. Japan cannot project offensive military force. It cannot build a conventional war machine. For nearly 80 years, Japan has compensated for this by sheltering under the American security umbrella. This is not a metaphor. Japan hosts approximately 55,000 U.S. military personnel on its soil. Its security strategy is fundamentally dependent on American military presence and guarantee, and it operates in one of the most dangerous regional environments on Earth, sharing the Pacific with a nuclear-armed North Korea and a rapidly militarizing China that has become increasingly assertive in territorial disputes. This is the leverage Washington holds over Tokyo that goes far beyond any tariff schedule. When the United States signals, even subtly, even through implication rather than explicit statement, that trade access and security cooperation are linked to financial cooperation, Japan faces a calculation that is entirely different from a normal business negotiation. The cost of saying no is not just an economic cost. It is a national security cost. And in that environment, compliance begins to look far more rational than resistance. Some analysts and scholars who study power dynamics and international relations have started using a specific phrase to describe what is unfolding. They call it tributary logic. It is the idea that the weaker party in a relationship does not pay tribute because it wants to. It pays tribute because the alternative, facing the full hostility of a more powerful partner, is simply worse. This framework did not begin with Japan. It is playing out simultaneously with South Korea, which faces similar security dependencies and similar tariff pressures. It is playing out with members of the European Union, which are navigating their own delicate balance between trade exposure and the need for continued American security engagement. It is playing out across the entire architecture of post-war American alliance relationships. But Japan's case is the most visible, the most financially significant, and the most structurally stark. The financial exposure is over $1 trillion. The security dependence is existential. The economic vulnerability, centered on the automobile industry, is acute. Tokyo has very little room to maneuver, and Washington almost certainly knows it. Japan is not being bullied in the crude, obvious sense of that word. The language being used is diplomatic. The meetings are courteous. The frameworks being discussed are wrapped in the vocabulary of partnership and mutual benefit. But underneath the politeness, the structure of the conversation is unmistakable. This is power being converted into financial advantage, and it is happening in real time. Now step back from the Japan-US dynamic specifically and look at the bigger picture, because the implications here stretch far beyond any bilateral deal. The entire post-war global financial system was built on a foundational assumption. Countries held U.S. dollars and U.S. Treasury bonds because they chose to, because it was the rational, market-driven decision, because American institutions were trustworthy and American assets were the safest in the world. That voluntary confidence is what gave the dollar its extraordinary privilege as the world's reserve currency. It was not maintained by force, it was maintained by trust. And that distinction matters enormously, because trust, once it begins to erode, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. When allied nations begin purchasing American debt, not purely because it is the best investment, but because it is the price of maintaining a trade relationship or a security arrangement, the nature of the dollar system begins to shift. The transaction looks the same on a spreadsheet. But the motivation behind it is completely different. And motivations, in financial markets, have a way of eventually expressing themselves in behavior. Countries that feel financially coerced tend to diversify, quietly, gradually, and then suddenly. China has been reducing its U.S. Treasury holdings for years. Russia's reserves were effectively seized and frozen following the invasion of Ukraine, which sent a chilling message to every country that holds dollar-denominated assets. Even nations that have no political dispute with Washington are now quietly asking whether diversifying into gold, euros, or alternative reserve assets is a more prudent long-term strategy. The dollar's dominance has survived every challenge thrown at it over the past century. But this particular challenge is unlike any it has faced before, because it is not coming from adversaries. It is emerging from the logic of America's own foreign policy. Here is the reality that very few commentators in mainstream financial media are willing to state clearly and directly. The United States, at this point in its fiscal trajectory, faces a genuine and structural difficulty in financing itself, purely through market mechanisms at interest rates that are politically and economically manageable. The debt load is too large. The interest payments are too heavy. The political consensus required to either meaningfully raise taxes or make substantial cuts to government spending does not exist in Washington. That leaves a narrow and uncomfortable set of options, and none of them are particularly attractive. You can allow inflation to run hot and effectively erode the real value of the debt over time. But that punishes every saver, every retiree, and every working person who has put money aside. You can default, but that would trigger a global financial catastrophe of historic proportions. Or you can find creative ways to convince, encourage, or pressure the rest of the world to keep lending to you at rates that are more favorable than the open market would offer. The framework being built around Japan is an attempt at that third path, and it is unlikely to stop with Japan. As tariff negotiations continue to roll out across multiple continents, watch for the same pattern repeating itself. Trade pressure linked, explicitly or implicitly, to requests for financial accommodation. The new architecture of American trade policy may not primarily be about manufacturing jobs or closing trade deficits. It may be about building a sustainable financing model for the American state in a new era of permanent fiscal expansion. So here's where we land today. Japan, a democratic ally, a security partner, and one of the most economically sophisticated nations on Earth, is being asked to help finance America's debt under conditions that are shaped as much by geopolitical dependency as by economic logic. Whether you frame it as a trade deal, a strategic accord, a security arrangement, or something more uncomfortable than any of those labels suggest, the underlying dynamic is clear. Power is being converted into financial advantage, and the country absorbing the cost of that conversion is not an adversary. It is a friend. If it can happen to Japan, with all of its economic sophistication, all of its diplomatic capital, and all of its decades of loyal partnership, then understand that the logic does not stop at Japan's borders. The story is still being written. The negotiations are ongoing. No formal accord has been signed, but the direction of travel is now visible to anyone paying close enough attention. The world is moving, gradually but unmistakably, from a financial order based on voluntary confidence to one increasingly shaped by strategic pressure. And that transition will define the next chapter of global economics in ways that most people are only beginning to imagine. I am John Agg, and this is the John Agg Official. If this kind of analysis matters to you, if you want to understand what is really driving the decisions being made in the corridors of global power, then subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who deserves to know the full picture. The mainstream conversation on this topic is barely scratching the surface. We go deeper. I will see you in the next one.